You have solid plans, but somehow your strategies never work in the real world the way they do in your head. Every day you watch others outmaneuver you, people who think 3 steps ahead while you're still figuring out step 1. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose principles have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years. What I discovered about daily strategic mastery will transform how you approach every challenge, giving you the mental framework to anticipate, adapt, and always maintain the advantage. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of strategy. Let me take you back to where it all began, to ancient China during the spring and autumn period, when kingdoms rose and fell like morning mist. I grew up surrounded by the constant drumbeat of war, watching armies march past our village with banners flying and bronze weapons gleaming in the sun. But what struck me most wasn't the spectacle, it was the waste. I would sit with my bamboo scroll of first principles, recording my observations as young generals led their men into battles they had no hope of winning. These weren't evil men or cowards. They were brave, honorable leaders who simply didn't understand that courage without strategy is just organized suicide. I watched thousands die because their commanders confused activity with progress, aggression with intelligence. The artifact that shaped my early thinking was this simple bamboo scroll, where I first wrote down what I called the fundamental strategic concepts, while other young men my age practiced sword forms and studied poetry. I was obsessing over patterns. Why did some armies win against impossible odds, while others lost despite every advantage? Why did some generals inspire absolute loyalty while others faced mutiny before the first battle? My family thought I was wasting my time. Strategy is for old men in palaces, my father would say. Real men fight with their hands, not their heads. But I had seen too much death, too much unnecessary suffering caused by leaders who thought strategy meant charging harder or shouting louder. The turning point came when I witnessed a battle between 2 rival states. The larger army had twice the soldiers, better weapons, and favorable terrain. Their general was famous throughout the region for his battlefield courage. The smaller army was led by a quiet man I had never heard of, someone who spent more time studying maps than polishing his armor. The famous general did exactly what everyone expected. He charged directly at the enemy's strongest point, relying on superior numbers and personal bravery to carry the day. It should have worked. By every conventional measure, victory was inevitable. But the quiet general had spent weeks studying his opponent's patterns. He knew the famous general's preference for direct assault. He had positioned his forces to absorb the initial charge, then systematically dismantled the larger army piece by piece. The battle was over in 3 hours. The famous general lay dead, and his superior force was completely destroyed. That night, I wrote my first real strategic principle on my bamboo scroll. Victory goes not to the strongest or bravest, but to those who understand the true nature of the conflict. This wasn't just about warfare. This was about life itself. I realized that most people approach challenges the same way that famous general approached battle. They see an obstacle and immediately think about how to charge through it harder or faster. They mistake motion for progress, effort for effectiveness. They fail because they never step back to understand what they're really fighting against. From that moment, I dedicated my life to developing a systematic approach to strategic thinking, not just for military commanders, but for anyone who wanted to achieve something meaningful in a world full of competition and conflict. I began to see strategy not as a collection of tricks or tactics, but as a fundamental way of thinking about cause and effect, about positioning and timing, about understanding both yourself and your environment deeply enough to find the path of least resistance to your goals. There was a moment in my early career that changed everything I thought I knew about strategy. I was serving as an advisor to a local commander facing what seemed like a straightforward territorial dispute. A neighboring lord was moving troops toward our border, making aggressive gestures, sending hostile messages. Every sign pointed to an imminent invasion. My jade chess set became my constant companion during this crisis. I would spend hours moving the pieces around, trying to visualize different scenarios and responses. The stones were cool to the touch, each one representing different forces and possibilities. But no matter how I arranged them, I kept coming to the same conclusion. We were outmatched and needed to prepare for a desperate defensive battle. The commander wanted to strike first. We cannot let them choose the time and place of battle. He argued, our only hope is to hit them before they're fully prepared. It seemed logical. It felt like the right response to an obvious threat. But something nagged at me. I had been studying this neighboring lord for months, tracking his patterns, his preferences, his past behavior. He was known for careful planning, not reckless aggression. Why would he suddenly become so obvious in his intentions? Why would a careful strategist telegraph his moves so clearly? That's when I realized I was looking at the wrong chessboard entirely. I began investigating beyond the obvious. Military movements. What I discovered changed my understanding of conflict forever. The neighboring lord wasn't planning to invade us at all. He was being threatened by a third party, a larger kingdom that wanted to expand into our region. His aggressive movements were actually defensive preparations, and his hostile messages were designed to make us look like the aggressors. The real enemy was using both of us as pawns in a larger game. They wanted us to fight each other, weakening both territories so they could sweep in and claim everything with minimal resistance. The visible threat was a deception hiding the invisible manipulation. This is when I first wrote down what would become one of my most important principles. All warfare is based on deception. But I didn't mean that you should lie or trick people. I meant that you must always look beyond the surface of what appears to be happening to understand what is actually happening. The neighboring lord and I ended up forming an alliance instead of fighting each other. Together, we were strong enough to deter the real threat. What could have been a devastating war that destroyed both our territories became a demonstration of strength that preserved peace. But the lesson went far deeper than military tactics. I realized that most people go through life reacting to symptoms instead of addressing causes. They see someone acting aggressively and assume aggression is the problem, when the real issue might be fear or desperation. They see competitors making certain moves and immediately respond to those moves, without asking why those moves are being made. The jade chess pieces taught me to always ask, what am I not seeing? What's the game behind the game? What would make this person's seemingly irrational behavior actually make perfect sense? In every situation, whether it's a business negotiation, a family conflict, or a career challenge, there are always multiple layers of reality operating simultaneously. Most people only see the first layer, the obvious one. Strategic thinkers learn to see through the surface too, understand the deeper currents that are really driving events. This insight transformed how I approached every challenge. Instead of immediately reacting to what people said or did, I started asking what circumstances or pressures might be causing them to say or do those things. Instead of taking situations at face value, I began looking for the hidden dynamics that create the visible symptoms. The real battlefield is never where you think it is. The visible moves are rarely the most important ones. True strategic thinking begins when you train yourself to see beyond the obvious, to read the intentions behind the actions, to understand the fears and desires that drive behavior. Every morning before dawn, while others still slept, I would sit with my dawn assessment tablet, a flat piece of stone, where I recorded my daily strategic observations. This ritual became the foundation of everything I accomplished. Because I learned that strategic thinking isn't something you do occasionally when facing big decisions. It's a daily practice that shapes how you see and respond to the world. Most people wake up and immediately start reacting. They check messages, respond to urgent requests, put out fires. They spend their entire day in reaction mode, bouncing from one crisis to the next like a stone skipping across water. By evening, they're exhausted but have no clear sense of progress or direction. I discovered that strategic minds work differently. They start each day by stepping back to assess the bigger picture before engaging with the immediate demands. They ask themselves for crucial questions that transform how they approach everything that follows. The first question I would inscribe on my stone tablet: what is my true position right now? Not where I hoped to be or where I used to be, but where I actually stood at this moment. This meant honestly evaluating my resources, relationships, capabilities, and constraints. Most people deceive themselves about their real position, which makes every subsequent decision less effective. I would map out my genuine strengths, not the ones I wished I had, but the ones I could actually deploy today. I would acknowledge my real weaknesses, not to criticize myself, but to avoid strategies that depended on capabilities I didn't possess. I would assess my relationships honestly, understanding who genuinely supported me, who opposed me, and who remained neutral. The second question: what are the true positions of others who matter? This meant looking beyond what people said or appeared to be doing to understand their actual capabilities, motivations, and constraints. I learned that people rarely reveal their real position directly. They present themselves as stronger or weaker than they actually are, depending on what serves their purposes. I would study the patterns of allies and competitors, not just their words or current actions. What were they really capable of? What did they genuinely want? What pressures were they under that might influence their future decisions? This intelligence gathering wasn't about paranoia. It was about understanding the full context in which I needed to operate. The third question: what is really changing and what remains constant? Every day brings new information and developments, but most people either ignore changes until they become crises or overreact to minor fluctuations as if they were major shifts. Strategic assessment requires distinguishing between meaningful changes that require adaptation and temporary variations that should be ignored. I would identify trends that were gaining momentum, relationships that were shifting, opportunities that were emerging or disappearing. But I would also remind myself of the fundamental constants, the principles and patterns that remain stable regardless of surface changes. The fourth question: where do I want to be positioned when today ends? This wasn't about setting impossible goals or unrealistic expectations. It was about identifying the one or two most important ways I could improve my position during the day ahead. What small movements could compound into significant advantages over time. This daily practice transformed my decision-making throughout each day. Instead of reacting emotionally to events as they unfolded, I had a clear framework for evaluating whether opportunities aligned with my strategic objectives. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions by urgent demands, I could prioritize based on what would actually move me toward better positions. The stone tablet kept me honest. Writing down my assessments made it harder to deceive myself or forget important insights. Reviewing previous assessments helped me track which of my judgments had been accurate and which needed refinement. What surprised me was how this morning practice began to feel less like work and more like meditation. Taking time to think strategically before engaging with daily demands created a sense of calm confidence that carried through even chaotic days. I wasn't just busy, I was intentionally working toward specific objectives. You can develop this same capability. Start tomorrow morning by asking yourself these 4 questions before checking messages or diving into tasks. Write down your honest answers. Notice how this shift from immediate reaction to strategic assessment changes the quality of your decisions throughout the day. I learned the hardest lesson of my strategic education through near-complete disaster. There was a campaign where I had superior intelligence, better positioning, and what seemed like every possible advantage. I was so confident in my analysis of the external situation that I barely considered my own limitations. That oversight nearly cost me everything and taught me why self-knowledge is the foundation of all strategic thinking. My self-knowledge, compasser, simple bronze instrument I created to help measure personal strengths and weaknesses, became my most trusted tool after this failure. But let me tell you the story of why I needed it. I was advising a commander facing a complex siege situation. The enemy fortress was well defended, but I had identified several weaknesses in their supply lines and defensive positions. My plan was elegant, sophisticated, and theoretically sound. It required precise timing, perfect coordination, and flawless execution across multiple fronts simultaneously. The plan failed catastrophically, not because my analysis of the enemy was wrong, but because I had fundamentally misunderstood my own capabilities and those of the forces I was directing. I had designed a strategy that required skills and resources we simply didn't possess. I had confused what I could see with what I could actually accomplish. The siege dragged on for months longer than necessary. Men died because of my intellectual arrogance. Resources were wasted. Morale collapsed. What should have been an efficient victory became a grinding war of attrition that we barely won. Sitting in my tent after that campaign, I realized I had made the most basic strategic error possible. I had failed to know myself. I thought I knew myself well. I could analyze enemy positions, predict their movements, understand their motivations. But I had never applied that same ruthless analysis to my own capabilities and limitations. I had never honestly assessed what I could and couldn't realistically accomplish. This is when I developed my self-knowledge compass, not a physical navigation tool, but a systematic method for maintaining accurate self. The compass had 4 cardinal directions: strengths I could deploy, weaknesses I must account for, resources I could access, and constraints I must respect. For strengths, I learned to distinguish between theoretical capabilities and practical ones. I might understand a brilliant tactical maneuver in principle, but if I couldn't communicate it clearly enough for others to execute, it wasn't a real strength. I might have access to certain resources on paper, but if I couldn't mobilize them quickly enough, they weren't genuine assets. For weaknesses, I had to overcome my ego and acknowledge genuine limitations. I was excellent at long-term strategic planning, but sometimes impatient with day-to-day implementation details. I could inspire people through ideas, but sometimes struggled with the personal relationships necessary to maintain loyalty over time. These weren't character flaws to be ashamed of. They were constraints to plan around. For resources, I needed to understand not just what I had access to, but what I could realistically deploy when needed. Having allies on paper doesn't help if they can't or won't act when called upon. Having theoretical authority doesn't matter if people don't actually follow your directions. For constraints, I had to acknowledge the boundaries within which I had to operate. Time limitations, resource limitations, political limitations, even personal energy limitations. The most brilliant strategy is worthless if it requires resources you don't have, or time you can't spare. The daily practice became this. Before making any significant decision, I would check my position on each point of the compass. Was I about to rely on strengths I thought I had, but couldn't actually deploy? Was I ignoring weaknesses that would sabotage my plans? Was I counting on resources that weren't really available? Was I violating constraints that would make success impossible? This practice was humbling but liberating. When you stop pretending to be stronger than you are, You can develop strategies that work with your actual capabilities rather than your imagined ones. When you acknowledge your real weaknesses, you can either strengthen them or design around them instead of being blindsided by them. Most people fail strategically, not because they can't understand their situations, but because they can't see themselves clearly within those situations. They overestimate their strengths, minimize their weaknesses, assume resources they can't access, and ignore constraints that will inevitably stop them. Self-deception is the fastest path to defeat because it makes every other aspect of strategic thinking irrelevant. You can have perfect intelligence about external circumstances, but if you misunderstand your own position, you'll make decisions that can't possibly work. My observation, journaler, leather-bound record where I catalogued the behavioral patterns and motivations of everyone I encountered taught me that understanding others is both an art and a science. Most people think they're good judges of character, but they're usually just projecting their own thinking onto others. True strategic intelligence requires learning to see people as they actually are, not as you assume them to be. I developed my system for reading others through years of careful observation and painful mistakes. Early in my career, I would watch someone for a few days, think I understood their patterns, then be completely surprised when they acted in ways I hadn't predicted. I realized I was seeing only the surface behaviors without understanding the deeper motivations that drove them. The breakthrough came when I started treating people like complex systems rather than simple machines. A machine does the same thing every time you push the same button, but people are influenced by hidden pressures, unconscious fears, unspoken desires, and past experiences that shape their responses in ways that aren't immediately obvious. I learned to look for the subtle signs that reveal true intentions and capabilities. The way someone's voice changes when discussing certain topics, how they position their body when feeling defensive or confident, which subjects they avoid or redirect away from, how they treat people who can't help or harm them. These microsignals often tell you more about someone's real character than their carefully crafted public presentation. My journal contained detailed observations about patterns I noticed over time. One military commander always became more aggressive when he felt his reputation was being questioned, even when aggression was tactically inappropriate. A political advisor consistently gave whatever advice she thought would make her look smart, regardless of whether it was actually useful. A merchant would always test boundaries with small deceptions before attempting larger ones. But the most important insight was learning to understand motivations rather than just behaviors. People can change their behaviors relatively easily, but their core motivations remain remarkably consistent. Someone motivated primarily by security will make different choices than someone motivated by recognition or adventure. Even when facing identical situations, I developed a classification system for the fundamental drives that seem to influence most decisions: the desire for safety and security, the need for recognition and status, the pursuit of pleasure and comfort, the drive for control and influence, and the search for meaning and purpose. Everyone has all of these motivations to some degree, but most people have one or two that dominate their thinking. Understanding someone's primary motivations allows you to predict their likely responses to different situations. If someone is primarily motivated by security, they'll tend toward conservative choices and be resistant to risks, even potentially beneficial ones. If someone is driven by recognition, they'll make decisions that enhance their reputation, even when other choices might be more practical. The daily practice became this: in every significant interaction, I would observe not just what people said or did, but what those words and actions revealed about their underlying concerns and desires. I would ask myself, what would make this person's behavior make perfect sense from their perspective? This wasn't about manipulation or exploitation. Understanding others better actually made me more effective at finding solutions that worked for everyone involved. When you understand what someone really wants, you can often find ways to help them get it, while also achieving your own objectives. I also learned to pay attention to what people revealed about themselves when they thought they were being clever or subtle, the stories they chose to tell, the complaints they made, the assumptions they expressed. All of these provided windows into their thinking patterns and priorities. The journal helped me track the accuracy of my assessments over time. I would write down my predictions about how certain people would respond to various situations, then review those predictions later to see where I had been right and where I had missed important factors. What I discovered was that most people are far more predictable than they think they are, but in different ways than you might expect. Their specific actions might vary, but their underlying patterns of decision-making remain remarkably consistent once you understand the fears and desires that drive them. This skill transformed my effectiveness in every area of life. In negotiations, I could anticipate, counter-arguments, and prepare responses that addressed the other party's real concerns, rather than just their stated positions. In building alliances, I could offer partnerships that appealed to each person's dominant motivations. In anticipating opponents' moves, I could think several steps ahead by understanding the logic that would guide their choices. The negotiation fan I carried became the symbol of my greatest strategic insight, that the highest form of victory is achieved without conflict at all. Let me tell you about the day I learned that fighting, no matter how skillfully done, represents a failure of strategy. I was facing what seemed like an impossible situation. A powerful warlord had been systematically conquering the smaller territories around us, growing stronger with each victory. His army was larger, better equipped, and more experienced than ours. Every strategic analysis suggested the direct confrontation would be suicidal, but surrender seemed equally unacceptable. My advisors urged immediate action. We must strike while we still have some chance, they argued. If we wait, he'll only grow stronger. The pressure to fight was enormous, not just from my own people, but from allies who feared that our defeat would leave them more vulnerable. But I had been studying this warlord's previous campaigns, and I noticed something interesting. While he was undoubtedly skilled at winning battles, he was less successful at consolidating his victories. His conquered territories often rebelled within months of his departure. His own generals were growing wealthy from plunder but showed signs of war weariness. His supply lines were becoming increasingly stretched across the expanding territory he controlled. Instead of preparing for battle, I spent weeks developing what I called positioning strategy, using my negotiation fan, a simple bamboo fan that became my symbol for achieving goals through positioning rather than force. I mapped out a completely different approach. Rather than confronting his strength directly, I began making his victories more costly and less rewarding. I formed quiet alliances with territories he had already conquered, helping organize resistance movements that would activate after his army moved on. I established intelligence networks that could provide advance warning of his movements to potential targets. I began disrupting his supply lines through coordinated efforts that looked like random banditry. Most importantly, I started changing the conversation among the regional powers. Instead of everyone focusing on their individual survival against this threat, I helped them see the bigger picture, that allowing any single power to dominate the entire region would ultimately threaten everyone's independence. The breakthrough came when I realized that this warlord's greatest strength, his string of military victories, could be turned into his greatest weakness. Each conquest had made him more enemies, stretched his resources thinner, and increased the expectations of his own followers for continued success and plunder. I arranged for him to receive what appeared to be intelligence about a wealthy, poorly defended city that would be an easy target. In reality, it was a carefully laid trap. The city was well defended by hidden allies. The route there would expose his army to attacks from multiple directions, and the intelligence came from sources I had carefully positioned to feed him misleading information. But here's the crucial part. I never intended for this trap to destroy his army. That would have required a massive battle with enormous casualties on both sides. Instead, I designed it to demonstrate that his intelligence networks were compromised, his supply lines were vulnerable, and his enemies were more organized and numerous than he had realized. When his advance forces encountered unexpected resistance and coordinated attacks on their supply lines, he faced a choice: commit to a costly battle with uncertain outcomes, or reconsider his entire expansion strategy. The negotiation fan came into play during the subtle diplomatic contacts that followed. Rather than demanding surrender, I offered him something more valuable: a face-saving way to redirect his ambitions toward targets that wouldn't threaten us, and a partnership arrangement that would give him more wealth and influence with less risk and effort. The final agreement was brilliant in its simplicity. He would redirect his expansion toward regions where we had no interests, in exchange for intelligence and logistical support that would make those campaigns more successful and profitable. We would establish formal boundaries that neither side would cross, backed by a mutual assistance pact against any outside threats to the region. The entire resolution took place without a single battle between our main forces. No soldiers died. No resources were wasted on destruction. No territory was devastated by warfare. Both sides ended up stronger and more secure than when the conflict began. This experience taught me that fighting should always be the last resort, not because violence is morally wrong, but because it's strategically inefficient. When you fight, even if you win, you pay costs in resources, people, time, and opportunities that could have been used more productively. True strategic excellence lies in creating situations where others surrender their resistance, not because they're defeated, but because you've given them better alternatives that serve their interests more effectively than continued opposition. The war drum of opportunity that I kept in my command tent taught me one of the most difficult lessons in strategy: that timing matters more than almost any other factor. I learned this through a painful experience where I had perfect strategy, superior resources, and complete information, but moved at the wrong moment and nearly lost everything. I was coordinating a complex operation that required precise timing across multiple fronts. The plan was flawless on paper: simultaneous strikes that would cripple an opponent's ability to respond effectively while minimizing our own losses. I had studied every aspect of the situation, anticipated every possible response, prepared contingencies for numerous scenarios. But I made two critical errors in timing that taught me lessons I never forgot. First, I moved too fast. I was so eager to execute my brilliant plan that I acted before all the necessary pieces were properly positioned. Some of my allies weren't quite ready. Certain resources hadn't arrived at their designated locations, and key intelligence hadn't been fully confirmed. I convinced myself that these minor imperfections wouldn't matter because the overall strategy was so strong. The partial failure of the initial phase taught me that premature action often wastes the very advantages you're trying to exploit. Moving too quickly can turn your strengths into weaknesses and your assets into liabilities. But then I overcorrected and made the opposite mistake. I moved too slowly. After regrouping and reassessing, I spent weeks perfecting every detail, waiting for ideal conditions, trying to eliminate every possible risk. By the time I finally acted, the strategic landscape had shifted. My opponent had recognized the threat and adapted his positions. Opportunities that had been available earlier had disappeared. This taught me that perfect timing isn't about finding the ideal moment, it's about understanding the natural rhythms that govern every situation and moving in harmony with those rhythms, rather than against them. My war drum became a tool for teaching this concept. Every situation has its own rhythm, like music. There are moments when the rhythm calls for action, and moments when it calls for patience. There are accelerating phases when things happen quickly and decelerating phases when progress slows. There are crescendos where maximum effort is required and quiet passages where subtle preparation is more important. Learned to recognize the natural rhythms in every situation by paying attention to multiple factors simultaneously. The energy levels and attention spans of the people involved, the external pressures that were increasing or decreasing over time, the availability of resources and opportunities, the actions and reactions of other strategic players. Most importantly, I learned to distinguish between the rhythm of the situation itself and my own internal rhythm of anxiety or eagerness, my personal desire to get things done quickly, or my fear of taking risks, or my excitement about a clever plan. These internal rhythms often conflicted with the external rhythms that actually determined when action would be most effective. The daily practice became this: before making any significant move, I would ask myself whether this was a moment in the situation's natural rhythm that called for action, or whether the rhythm was calling for patience and preparation. I learned to feel the difference between productive waiting, where you're positioning yourself for the right moment, and passive hesitation, where you're just avoiding necessary action. I also learned to recognize when situations were accelerating and required faster decision-making versus when they were in slower phases where more careful deliberation was appropriate. During crisis periods, the rhythm demands quick adaptation and rapid response. During stable periods, the rhythm rewards thorough analysis and careful planning. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that speed and timing are not the same thing. Speed is about how fast you move. Timing is about when you move. You can move very quickly at the right moment, or very slowly at the right moment. Both can be perfect timing. But moving at the wrong moment, regardless of speed, almost always leads to inefficiency or failure. The war drum taught me to feel the pulse of each situation and synchronize my actions with that pulse. Sometimes this meant striking like lightning when opportunities appeared. Sometimes it meant waiting patiently while circumstances developed. Sometimes it meant maintaining steady pressure over extended periods. I learned that most strategic failures happen not because people don't know what to do, but because they do the right things at the wrong times. They try to force their preferred timing onto situations that have their own natural rhythms, like trying to make music by ignoring the beat. My collection of tactical maps became my most treasured possessions because they taught me a fundamental truth. Position determines possibility. You can have the best strategy in the world, but if you're in the wrong position, that strategy becomes irrelevant. Let me tell you about the day I learned that changing your position is often more powerful than changing your strategy. I was advising a commander who was convinced he was facing a tactical problem. His forces were well trained, properly equipped, but they kept losing engagements against an enemy that seemed inferior in every measurable way. He wanted me to help him develop better battle tactics, improve his soldiers' fighting techniques, or find more effective weapons. But when I spread out my detailed maps and began studying the actual terrain where these engagements were taking place, I realized the problem had nothing to do with tactics or equipment. The issue was positional. Every time my commander chose to fight, he was doing so from disadvantageous ground that negated all of his superior resources and training. The enemy, meanwhile, was consistently maneuvering to fight only when they could dictate the terms of engagement. They would withdraw when conditions didn't favor them, and advance only when the terrain gave them advantages that compensated for their other weaknesses. They were winning not because they were better fighters, but because they were better at choosing where and when to fight. This insight revolutionized my understanding of strategy. I began to see that every situation, not just military ones, has its own terrain that creates advantages and disadvantages for different approaches. In business negotiations, the terrain might be timing, information, asymmetries, or relationship dynamics. In personal relationships, the terrain might be emotional states, shared history, or external pressures. My maps taught me to identify different types of strategic terrain and understand how each type influenced what was possible. Some terrain is advantageous ground, situations where your natural strengths are maximized and your weaknesses are minimized. Other terrain is difficult ground, situations where your strengths are neutralized and your weaknesses are exposed. I learned to recognize contested ground situations where multiple parties have legitimate claims or interests, requiring different strategies than when you're operating in open ground where you have more freedom of action. There's narrow ground, situations with limited options that require focused approaches, and wide ground, situations with many possibilities that reward flexible thinking. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to identify death ground situations where failure to succeed would have catastrophic consequences, and life ground situations where even partial success would create significant benefits. The daily practice became this: before committing to any significant action, I would assess the strategic terrain carefully. What aspects of this situation favored my approach, and what aspects worked against it? Could I change my position to more favorable ground before engaging? Could I influence the terrain itself to make it more advantageous? I discovered that many strategic problems that seem impossible from one position become much more manageable from a different position. Instead of trying to force solutions that work against the natural characteristics of your current terrain, it's often more effective to move to terrain that makes your preferred solutions viable. This principle transformed how I approached every kind of challenge. In diplomatic negotiations, instead of trying to win arguments on topics where the other party had natural advantages, I would redirect conversations toward areas where my position was stronger. In resource allocation decisions, instead of trying to maximize efficiency in areas where the fundamental conditions made efficiency difficult, I would shift resources toward areas where the same effort would produce better results. I also learned that you can sometimes change the terrain itself rather than just your position within it. By introducing new information, changing the timing of discussions, involving different people, or reframing how problems are understood, you can alter the strategic landscape in ways that create new possibilities. The maps showed me that position is dynamic, not static. The same physical or strategic location might be advantageous at one time and disadvantageous at another, depending on changing circumstances. Effective positioning requires continuous assessment and adjustment as conditions evolve. Most importantly, I learned that superior positioning often matters more than superior resources. A smaller force on favorable ground can defeat a larger force on unfavorable ground. A business with the right market position can outcompete larger competitors. A person with the right social or professional positioning can achieve goals that would be impossible through effort alone. The key insight is that position creates leverage. When you're positioned correctly, your efforts are amplified and your resources are used more effectively. When you're poorly positioned, even tremendous efforts may produce minimal results. My commander's seal a simple bronze disc that represented unified decision-making. Authority taught me perhaps the most personal lesson in all of strategy, that you must be the undisputed general of your own life. I learned this through watching a brilliant military leader destroy himself through internal division, and nearly making the same mistake myself. I was working with a commander who had everything necessary for success: superior resources, excellent intelligence, loyal troops, and favorable strategic position. But he had one fatal weakness that undermined all of these advantages. He couldn't make unified decisions. He would listen to his advisors, then second-guess himself. He would commit to a course of action, then immediately begin doubting whether it was the right choice. His internal conflict created external chaos. Orders would be given, then modified, then reversed. Troops would begin moving in one direction, then receive new instructions to move in another. Resources would be allocated to support one plan, then reallocated when he changed his mind. The army began to lose confidence, not just in his decisions, but in his ability to stick with any decision long enough for it to work. What made this tragedy worse was that most of his individual decisions were actually sound. The problem wasn't his strategic thinking, it was his inability to commit fully to any single strategic direction. He was trying to hedge against every possible risk by keeping multiple options open simultaneously. But this divided approach made all of his options less effective. Watching his downfall forced me to examine my own decision-making patterns, and I was horrified to recognize similar tendencies. I found myself constantly second-guessing my choices, maintaining mental reservations about plans I had already committed to implement, and dividing my energy between multiple approaches instead of concentrating it behind one clear direction. This is when I created my Commander's Seal ritual. The physical seal represented the moment when internal deliberation ended and unified action began. When I pressed that seal onto orders or plans, I was making a commitment not just to others, but to myself. This decision would receive my complete support and energy until circumstances genuinely required a change. The seal taught me that unity of command isn't just about organizational structure, it's about internal psychological discipline. Most people live in a state of constant internal civil war. Part of them wants security, while another part craves adventure. Part of them values relationships, while another part prioritizes achievement. Part of them seeks comfort, while another part demands growth. These internal conflicts aren't necessarily problems. Having multiple values and desires is natural and healthy. The problem comes when these different aspects of yourself are constantly fighting for control over your decisions and actions. When you try to satisfy competing priorities simultaneously, you end up making compromises that don't really serve any of your interests effectively. I learned to establish clear command structures within myself. For any significant decision, I would first acknowledge all of my competing interests and concerns. I would give each perspective a fair hearing and understand what it was trying to protect or achieve. But then I would make a definitive choice about which priority would take precedence in this particular situation, and I would commit to supporting that choice fully. This didn't mean ignoring my other values or interests. It meant accepting that, in any specific decision, one set of priorities had to take command while others played supporting roles. I could value both security and growth, but when facing a particular opportunity, I had to decide which value would guide this specific choice. The daily practice became this. Before making any important decision, I would identify the different parts of myself that had opinions about the choice. I would listen to each perspective carefully and understand what it was trying to accomplish. Then I would consciously choose which aspect of myself would be in command for this decision, and I would commit to following that direction completely. This created remarkable clarity and effectiveness in my actions. Instead of moving forward with mental reservations that undermined my commitment, I could put my full energy behind my choices. Instead of constantly questioning decisions I had already made, I could focus on implementing them as effectively as possible. I also learned to recognize when circumstances had genuinely changed enough to warrant reconsidering a previous decision. The key was distinguishing between new information that actually changed the strategic situation versus normal doubts and fears that naturally arise when implementing any challenging plan. The Commander's Seal reminded me that leadership, whether of armies or of your own life requires the courage to make definitive choices and the discipline to support those choices with unified action. Divided leadership creates divided results, but unified command creates the possibility for focused power and clear progress. The spy network token, I carried a small jade disc that represented the importance of accurate information, became my reminder that all strategy depends on understanding reality as it actually is, not as you hope it to be or fear it might be. I learned this lesson through a catastrophic intelligence failure that nearly ended my career and taught me why. Information quality determines strategic success more than any other single factor. Early in my development as a strategist, I was overconfident in my analytical abilities. I believed that if I was clever enough, I could deduce everything I needed to know from limited information. I thought strategic thinking was primarily about reasoning from first principles and didn't pay enough attention to gathering accurate intelligence about current conditions. This arrogance led to a disastrous miscalculation. I was planning a complex operation based on what I believed to be accurate intelligence about enemy positions, capabilities, and intentions. My sources seemed reliable, my information appeared consistent, and my analysis was thorough and logical. But my intelligence was wrong in several crucial ways. The enemy had more resources than I had estimated, different motivations than I had assumed, and alliances I hadn't discovered. Worse, some of my supposedly reliable sources had been compromised and were feeding me deliberately misleading information. The operation failed not because my strategic thinking was flawed, but because I was making brilliant deductions from inaccurate premises. I was solving the wrong problem because I didn't understand the actual situation I was facing. This failure taught me that strategy without accurate intelligence is just elaborate guesswork. You can be the most sophisticated strategic thinker in the world, but if your understanding of reality is wrong, your strategies will fail regardless of how logically sound they appear. I began building systematic intelligence networks based on the principle that information must be gathered deliberately and evaluated carefully. It rarely arrives on its own in useful forms. I learned to distinguish between different types of information sources and understand the strengths and limitations of each. I classified sources into 5 categories: local sources who had direct access to relevant information but might lack broader context, distant sources who could provide perspective and comparison but might miss important details, interested sources who had motivations to provide information but also reasons to distort it, neutral sources who were more likely to be objective but might lack depth of knowledge, and hostile sources whose information might be valuable but was certainly biased or manipulated. The key insight was that no single source could provide complete or entirely accurate information. The art was in combining multiple sources with different perspectives and limitations to build a more complete and accurate picture than any individual source could provide. I developed daily practices for systematic information gathering that went far beyond just listening to reports or reading messages. I would actively seek out different perspectives on the same events. I would look for information that contradicted my existing assumptions or preferences. I would pay special attention to details that seemed minor but might indicate larger patterns. Most importantly, I learned to distinguish between information and intelligence. Information is raw data facts, observations, reports, rumors. Intelligence is the analysis and synthesis of information to understand what it means for your strategic situation. Having lots of information doesn't automatically create good intelligence. If you don't know how to evaluate and integrate it effectively, I established systematic methods for testing the reliability of information. I would look for multiple independent sources that confirmed important facts. I would examine whether information was consistent with other things I knew to be true. I would consider whether sources had the access and expertise necessary to know what they claimed to know, but I also learned to act on incomplete information when necessary. Perfect intelligence is rarely available when you need to make strategic decisions. The skill is in understanding how much uncertainty you can tolerate for different types of decisions, and making the best choices possible with the information you can reasonably obtain within your time constraints. The SPY network token reminded me that information advantage often determines outcomes more than resource advantages. A smaller force with better intelligence can defeat a larger force that doesn't understand the real situation. A business with better market intelligence can outcompete larger competitors who are making decisions based on outdated or inaccurate assumptions. I learned that most people make strategic mistakes not because they can't think strategically, but because they're thinking strategically about situations they don't actually understand. They base decisions on assumptions, hopes, fears, or outdated information rather than taking the time to gather and evaluate current, accurate intelligence about their real circumstances. My flowing water vessel, a specially designed bronze container that demonstrated how water adapts its shape while maintaining its essential nature, taught me one of the most crucial lessons in strategic thinking, that rigid strategies break under pressure, but adaptive strategies flow around obstacles to reach their objectives. I learned this lesson through a painful experience where I had developed what I considered a perfect strategy. Every detail had been carefully planned, every contingency anticipated, every resource allocated precisely. The strategy was elegant, efficient, and theoretically flawless. I was so proud of its sophistication that I became emotionally attached to executing it exactly as designed. When implementation began, reality immediately started diverging from my plan. Key allies were delayed by unexpected circumstances. Resources weren't available when needed. The opposition adapted their approach in ways I hadn't anticipated. External conditions shifted in response to factors I hadn't considered. Instead of adapting my strategy to these new realities, I tried to force reality to conform to my plan. I invested additional resources, trying to get back on the original timeline. I put pressure on allies to meet the original requirements. I ignored information that suggested my assumptions were no longer valid. The result was a disaster that taught me why inflexibility is the enemy of strategic success. My beautiful, perfect plan failed not because it was poorly conceived, but because I treated it as sacred scripture, rather than as a tool that should serve my objectives. This is when I began studying water as a model for strategic thinking. Water has a clear objective to reach the lowest point, but it achieves this objective by taking whatever path is available. When water encounters a rock, it doesn't try to smash through it or push it aside. It flows around the obstacle, finding whatever route allows it to continue moving toward its goal. Water demonstrates perfect adaptability while maintaining perfect consistency of purpose. It changes its shape, speed, and direction as needed, but it never changes its fundamental nature or abandons its objective. It can be patient when necessary, flowing slowly through narrow passages, or powerful when conditions allow. Rushing rapidly down steep slopes, I began applying this water principle to all of my strategic thinking. I would establish clear objectives, the equivalent of water's drive toward the lowest point, but I would hold all of my methods and tactics lightly, ready to change them as circumstances required. The flowing water vessel became a daily reminder to check whether I was being appropriately adaptive. Was I holding on to methods that were no longer working because I was emotionally attached to them? Was I ignoring new information that suggested better approaches? Was I trying to force solutions that weren't appropriate for current conditions? I learned to distinguish between my core objectives, which should remain stable, and my methods for achieving those objectives, which should be constantly adjusted based on changing circumstances. This required developing what I called strategic detachment, the ability to remain fully committed to your goals while being completely flexible about how you achieve them. The daily practice became this. Whenever I encountered obstacles or unexpected developments, I would ask myself what water would do in this situation. Water doesn't waste energy fighting obstacles. It can't remove, it finds alternative paths. Water doesn't get frustrated by delays, accumulates until it has enough force to continue. Water doesn't abandon its objective when the direct path is blocked. It finds indirect routes that ultimately lead to the same destination. This water-like approach transformed my effectiveness dramatically. Instead of seeing obstacles as failures of my planning, I began seeing them as information about the current state of reality that should inform my next moves. Instead of treating setbacks as disasters, I began treating them as natural parts of any complex process that require tactical adjustments while maintaining strategic direction. I also learned that adaptability isn't the same as having no plan or changing directions randomly. Water is incredibly adaptive, but it's also incredibly persistent. It never stops moving toward its objective, even when progress is slow or indirect. It maintains consistent pressure over time, gradually wearing away obstacles that seemed immovable initially. The key insight was that effective strategy requires both firmness and flexibility. Firmness about your ultimate objectives and core principles, but flexibility about everything else. This combination allows you to maintain clear direction while adapting to whatever conditions you encounter along the way. Most strategic failures happen not because people's goals are wrong or their initial plans are inadequate, but because they can't adapt effectively when reality proves different from their expectations. They either abandon their objectives too quickly when they encounter difficulties, or they stick rigidly to methods that are no longer appropriate for current conditions. The 5 types medallion. I wore a bronze disc inscribed with symbols representing different categories of information sources. Reminded me that intelligence gathering is both an art and a science that requires systematic thinking about how information flows and how to access it ethically and effectively. My classification system for intelligence sources grew out of years of observing how information moved through complex social and political networks. I realized that different types of sources provided different kinds of intelligence, each with its own strengths and limitations that had to be understood and accounted for. The first type I called local spies, people who were part of your own organization or community but could provide information about internal conditions, morale, capabilities, and concerns. In military contexts, these were soldiers and officers who could report on the true state of your own forces. In modern contexts, these might be colleagues, team members, or advisors who can give you honest assessments of your organization's real strengths and weaknesses. The key with local spies is ensuring they feel safe telling you uncomfortable truths. Most leaders unknowingly discourage honest internal intelligence by reacting poorly to bad news or criticism. I learned to actively seek out dissenting opinions and negative feedback, not because I enjoyed hearing it, but because accurate self-knowledge is essential for effective strategy. The second type, one called inside spies, people within your opponent's or competitor's organization who could provide information about their plans, capabilities, and internal dynamics. In ancient warfare, these might be enemy soldiers who could be turned or officials who could be bribed. In modern contexts, these might be industry contacts, former employees of competitors, or people with access to information about organizations you need to understand. The ethical line is crucial here. I'm not talking about anything illegal, unethical, or harmful. I'm talking about the natural flow of information that occurs when you maintain good relationships with people throughout your industry or field. When you listen carefully to what people share in professional or social contexts, and when you pay attention to public information that reveals patterns about how organizations or individuals operate. The third type I called converted spies, people who were originally opposed to you but became sources of information through persuasion, shared interests, or changing circumstances. These sources can be particularly valuable because they understand both your perspective and your opponent's perspective, but they require careful handling because their loyalties may be complex or unstable. The fourth type I called doomed spies, sources who could provide crucial information but would likely be discovered and compromised. In warfare, these might be people who could infiltrate enemy positions but couldn't extract safely. In modern contexts, these might be sources of information that can only be used once before the source is revealed or circumstances change. Fifth type, one called surviving spies, long-term sources who could provide ongoing intelligence over extended periods. These are the most valuable sources because they can track changes over time and provide context that helps you understand not just what is happening, but what trends are developing. The medallion reminded me daily that effective intelligence gathering requires thinking systematically about all 5 types of sources and understanding how they complement each other. No single type provides complete information, but together they can give you a comprehensive understanding of your strategic environment. I developed ethical guidelines for intelligence gathering that respected both effectiveness and integrity. Information gathering should never involve deception, manipulation, or harm to others. Instead, it should be based on careful observation, thoughtful listening, maintaining good relationships, and paying attention to publicly available information that others might overlook or undervalue. The daily practice became this. I would regularly assess what types of information I needed to make effective strategic decisions, then consider which of the 5 types of sources might be able to provide that information ethically and effectively. I would maintain relationships with people who could serve as various types of sources, not by manipulating or deceiving them, but by being genuinely interested in their perspectives and generous with information that might be useful to them. I learned that most people are actually quite willing to share information if you ask thoughtfully, listen carefully, and reciprocate appropriately. The key is understanding what information people have access to, why they might be willing to share it, and how to ask in ways that serve their interests as well as yours. The 5-type system also taught me to evaluate the reliability and completeness of information based on understanding its source. Information from local spies might be very accurate about internal conditions, but limited in perspective about external factors. Information from converted spies might be detailed, but potentially biased by their complex loyalties. The momentum stone I kept in my tent, heavy piece of granite that represented concentrated energy, and forestaught me that strategic success depends not just on having energy, but on understanding how to concentrate and direct it for maximum impact. I learned this through watching talented people exhaust themselves without achieving their goals, and discovering why focused energy accomplishes more than scattered effort. I once observed 2 generals facing similar challenges with similar resources. Both were energetic, intelligent, and committed to their objectives, but one achieved decisive victory, while the other struggled for months with minimal progress. The difference wasn't in their capabilities or dedication, it was in how they managed and directed their energy. The successful general concentrated his efforts on a few critical objectives that would create cascading advantages if achieved. He identified the key points where success would make everything else easier, then applied overwhelming force to those specific targets. His energy was focused like sunlight through a magnifying glass, intense enough to create breakthrough results. The Struggling general dispersed his energy across many different objectives simultaneously. He was constantly busy, always working on multiple fronts, but never concentrating enough force in any single area to achieve decisive results. His energy was like sunlight, scattered across a wide area, warm but not intense enough to ignite anything. This observation led me to develop what I called the momentum principle. Strategic energy must be concentrated in time and space to create breakthrough results. Then, those initial breakthroughs must be expanded rapidly to build unstoppable momentum. The momentum stone reminded me daily that energy has both quantity and quality dimensions. Having more energy doesn't automatically create better results if that energy is dispersed or misdirected. But even limited energy can create dramatic results when properly concentrated and applied at the right points. I learned to identify what I called leverage points, specific objectives where success would create disproportionately large advantages. These might be key relationships that would open up multiple opportunities, skills that would improve performance across many areas, or positions that would provide access to resources and information needed for larger goals. Instead of trying to make progress on everything simultaneously, I would concentrate my available energy on achieving decisive success at one leverage point, then use that success to generate additional energy and momentum for tackling the next objective. The daily practice became this. Each morning, I would identify the one or two activities that had the highest potential to create momentum toward my larger objectives. I would allocate my peak energy, my best time, attention, and resources to those high leverage activities, treating everything else as secondary priorities that could be handled with whatever energy remained. This concentration principle extended beyond just time management to encompass all types of resources. Instead of spreading my attention across many relationships, I would focus on developing a few key relationships deeply. Instead of trying to improve many skills incrementally, I would focus on mastering one skill that would provide leverage across multiple areas. But concentration alone wasn't sufficient. The energy also had to be applied with proper timing to build momentum. Momentum is energy that compounds over time. Initial successes create advantages that make subsequent successes easier to achieve. Early victories provide resources, relationships, and credibility that can be leveraged for bigger victories. Learned to recognize the difference between productive momentum and mere activity. Productive momentum feels like you're building on previous successes, where each achievement makes the next one more achievable. Mere activity feels like you're constantly starting over, where each task requires the same amount of effort regardless of what you've accomplished previously. The momentum stone taught me that strategic energy must be both concentrated and sustained. Sprint-like bursts of intense effort can create breakthroughs, but those breakthroughs must be followed by sustained pressure to prevent opponents from recovering and regrouping. Develop techniques for maintaining momentum once it was established. This included celebrating successes in ways that generated additional energy and motivation, quickly capitalizing on advantages before they could be neutralized, and maintaining consistent pressure while opponents were off balance. The key insight was that momentum creates its own energy. When you're making visible progress toward meaningful goals, you naturally feel more motivated and energetic. When others see your success, they're more likely to support your efforts or join your cause. When obstacles are overcome through concentrated effort, confidence builds that makes future obstacles seem more manageable. Most people fail strategically not because they lack energy or capability, but because they never concentrate their energy enough to create breakthrough results that generate momentum. They stay busy but never build the kind of focused force that transforms situations decisively. The pressure point chart. I studied daily a detailed map showing critical vulnerability points in various systems taught me that every situation no matter how complex, has specific points where small applications of force can create disproportionately large results. Learning to find and exploit these leverage points became the foundation of all my strategic thinking. I discovered this principle through a seemingly impossible challenge. I was facing an opponent who was stronger than me in every conventional measure: more resources, more allies, better position, superior numbers. Any direct confrontation would have been suicidal. Every obvious approach led to certain failure, but I had learned to look beyond obvious strengths and weaknesses to find what I called the critical dependencies, the few key elements that everything else depended upon. Even the strongest systems have vulnerable points where they're dependent on factors they can't fully control. My opponent's greatest strength was his network of alliances, which gave him access to resources and support that I couldn't match directly. But as I studied this network more carefully, I realized it was also his greatest weakness. The alliance was held together by a complex web of mutual benefits and obligations that required constant maintenance and careful balance. More importantly, the entire network depended on one key relationship: his alliance with a powerful but proud regional leader who provided crucial resources, but was also notoriously sensitive about status and recognition. This leader had been feeling overlooked and underappreciated as my opponent's power had grown. Instead of trying to break the alliance through direct confrontation or competing offers, I focused on understanding what this key ally truly wanted: recognition for his contributions, an assurance that his own territory would be respected and protected. Through careful diplomatic work, I arranged for this leader to receive information about my opponent's private comments questioning his judgment and reliability. I also provided evidence that my opponent was making agreements with other allies that potentially compromised this leader's interests. The beauty of this approach was that I didn't have to lie or manipulate. I simply ensured that accurate information reached the right person at the right time, allowing him to draw his own conclusions about whether his alliance was serving his interests effectively. When this key ally withdrew his support, the entire network began to unravel. Other allies started questioning their own agreements and looking for better alternatives. My opponent found himself trying to hold together relationships that were naturally pulling apart once the central binding was removed. This experience taught me to always look for the keystone, the one element that supports multiple other elements. Remove the keystone, and structures that seemed solid become unstable. Strengthen the keystone, and the entire structure becomes more robust. I developed systematic methods for identifying these critical leverage points in any situation. First, I would map out all the important elements and understand how they related to each other. Then, I would look for dependencies, which elements relied on which other elements for their effectiveness. The pressure point chart helped me categorize different types of vulnerabilities. Some systems depend on continuous flows resources, information, or energy that must keep moving to maintain effectiveness. Disrupting these flows can cause rapid system failure. Other systems depend on key relationships that require ongoing maintenance and mutual benefit. These relationships often become vulnerable when circumstances change or when one party begins to feel the arrangement is no longer fair or beneficial. Still, other systems depend on critical resources that are scarce or difficult to replace. Understanding which resources are truly essential versus which are merely convenient can reveal unexpected vulnerabilities, but finding weak points was only half of the equation. I also had to understand strong points areas where opponents had genuine advantages that should be avoided rather than confronted directly. Trying to attack strength with strength usually leads to costly battles of attrition that benefit whoever has more resources to waste. The daily practice became this. In any competitive or challenging situation, I would systematically identify both the strong points that should be avoided and the weak points that could be exploited. I would look for ways to use my strengths against opponents' weaknesses while avoiding situations where their strengths would neutralize my advantages. This analysis extended beyond just competitive situations to include my own systems and structures. I would regularly examine my own critical dependencies and vulnerabilities, working to strengthen key relationships, diversify critical resources, and eliminate single points of failure that could cause systemic problems. The pressure point chart reminded me that strategic thinking is fundamentally about efficiency, achieving maximum results with minimum effort by finding the precise points where force can be most effectively applied. This isn't about working harder, but about working more precisely on the elements that truly determine outcomes. My formation tokens carved wooden pieces that represented different elements of coordinated movement taught me that managing complex strategies requires understanding how to orchestrate multiple moving pieces toward a single objective. This became crucial when I faced my first large-scale operation involving dozens of different units, timelines, and objectives that all had to work together seamlessly. The challenge seemed straightforward at first: coordinate a multi-pronged campaign that would achieve several objectives simultaneously, while maintaining operational security and adapting to changing conditions. But as planning progressed, I realized I was dealing with a level of complexity that required completely different thinking than the simpler strategies I had managed before. Each element of the operation had its own requirements, limitations, and optimal timing. Some units moved faster than others. Some objectives required secrecy, while others benefited from visibility. Some actions needed to happen in precise sequence, while others could be simultaneous. Some elements were more reliable than others, and some were more adaptable to changing circumstances. My first attempt at coordination was a disaster. I tried to control everything centrally, making detailed plans that specified exactly what each element should do at each point in time. When reality inevitably deviated from these detailed plans, the entire operation began to fall apart because individual elements couldn't adapt without disrupting other elements they were supposed to coordinate with. This failure taught me that complex operations can't be managed like simple ones. Instead of trying to control every detail centrally, I had to create systems that allowed coordinated action while preserving each element's ability to adapt to local conditions. The formation tokens became my tool for visualizing and practicing this new approach to coordination. Each token represented a different element of the operation, different units, different timelines, different objectives. By moving the tokens around, I could experiment with different coordination patterns and understand how changes in one area would affect others. I learned to distinguish between elements that needed tight coordination and elements that could operate more independently. Some actions were so interdependent that they required precise synchronization. These elements needed detailed coordination and constant communication. Other actions were more independent and could be given general objectives and allowed to adapt their specific methods based on local conditions. The key insight was developing what I called flexible synchronization, maintaining coordination on essential points while allowing adaptation on everything else. This required identifying the critical coordination points where different elements absolutely had to work together, then designing maximum flexibility around those fixed points. I established clear communication protocols that allowed different elements to share essential information without overwhelming the system with unnecessary details. Each element knew what information other elements needed from them, what information they needed from others, and how to communicate efficiently. When circumstances changed, the formation tokens taught me to think about coordination in terms of patterns and flows rather than rigid structures. Like a flock of birds or a school of fish, Effective coordination emerges from simple rules that allow individual elements to respond to local conditions while maintaining overall coherence. I developed what I called the 3 levels of coordination. Strategic coordination around major objectives and timing, tactical coordination around specific operations that required synchronized action, and operational independence for everything else. This hierarchical approach allowed maximum flexibility while ensuring that essential coordination happened where it was truly needed. The daily practice became this: for any complex situation involving multiple elements, I would identify which aspects required tight coordination, which required loose coordination, and which could be handled independently. I would establish clear communication channels for sharing essential information while avoiding information overload that could slow decision-making. I also learned to build redundancy into complex operations. When you're coordinating many moving pieces, some will inevitably fail or encounter unexpected obstacles. The system has to be designed so that the failure of individual elements doesn't cascade into system-wide failure. This meant having backup plans for critical functions, alternative approaches when primary methods weren't working, and enough flexibility that the overall objective could still be achieved even if some specific tactics had to be abandoned or modified. The formation tokens reminded me that complexity is manageable when you understand the difference between essential coordination and unnecessary control. Most coordination failures happen not because people can't work together, but because the coordination requirements are either too rigid to adapt to reality or too vague to create effective collaboration. The art of orchestrating complex situations lies in finding the precise level of coordination that maintains coherence without sacrificing adaptability tight enough to ensure that different elements support each other effectively, but loose enough to allow each element to respond optimally to its specific circumstances. My signal fire torch used to coordinate decisive, concentrated efforts became the symbol of perhaps the most crucial strategic skill: knowing when a situation calls for total commitment and maximum force. I learned this lesson through a moment of crisis that taught me the difference between measured responses and decisive action, and why that difference often determines success or failure. I was facing a situation where gradual, careful approaches had failed repeatedly. An opponent was systematically undermining my position through a series of small moves that individually seemed minor but collectively threatened to destroy everything I had built. My advisors recommended continuing with measured, proportional responses, matching each of his moves with a similar countermove. But I had been studying the broader pattern of the conflict, and I realized that this gradual approach was actually playing into my opponent's strategy. He was stronger in a prolonged war of attrition, but vulnerable to sudden, concentrated pressure that could overwhelm his ability to respond effectively. The signal fire torch represented the moment when I decided to abandon incremental responses and commit everything to a decisive strike. This wasn't a decision I made lightly or emotionally. It was based on careful analysis of when maximum force would be most effective and when partial measures would only prolong the conflict without resolving it. I had observed that certain situations have what I called decisive moments, points, where the entire dynamic of a conflict can be transformed through concentrated action, but only if that action is applied with overwhelming force within a narrow window of opportunity. The key was recognizing that some problems can't be solved through gradual pressure or compromise. They require decisive resolution that changes the fundamental balance of power. Half measures in these situations aren't just ineffective, they're actually counterproductive, because they warn opponents of your intentions without applying enough force to prevent their countermeasures. My opponent had been carefully building defensive positions and preparing for a long campaign of incremental moves. He was ready for measured escalation, but not prepared for sudden, concentrated attack across multiple fronts simultaneously. His defensive preparations were designed to handle gradual pressure, not overwhelming force applied all at once. The decisive action involved coordinating attacks on his key vulnerabilities simultaneously, using all available resources in a concentrated time period. Instead of spreading the effort over months with measured responses, I compressed everything into a few crucial days, where the cumulative impact would be too much for his systems to handle. The signal fire torch reminded me that this kind of decisive action requires three essential elements: accurate assessment of when maximum force is appropriate, sufficient resources to sustain concentrated action, and the courage to commit everything when the moment arrives. The assessment piece was crucial. Most situations don't require or benefit from maximum force. Gradual approaches are usually more efficient, less risky, and more sustainable. But certain situations, usually involving entrenched opposition or time-sensitive opportunities, only be resolved through decisive action that commits all available resources. Learned to recognize the signs that indicated when maximum force was appropriate, when gradual approaches had been tried and failed repeatedly, when the opponent was preparing for prolonged resistance that would make future action more costly, when a unique opportunity existed that wouldn't be available again, or when partial success would be worse than no action at all. The resource assessment was equally important. Decisive action requires having enough reserves to sustain maximum effort until the objective is achieved. Half-hearted attempts at decisive action often fail catastrophically because they provoke maximum resistance without having sufficient force to overcome it. Before committing to any fire attack, I would honestly assess whether I had the resources to sustain maximum effort long enough to achieve decisive results. This included not just material resources, but energy, attention, relationships, and credibility that would be consumed in the process. The courage element was perhaps the most challenging. Decisive action requires accepting significant risk and committing to a course that can't be easily reversed. There's always uncertainty about whether the assessment is correct and whether the resources will be sufficient. The temptation is to hedge by holding back some resources or maintaining escape routes. But this hedging often ensures failure. When I finally acted with the signal fire torch, the results exceeded even my optimistic projections. The concentrated pressure overwhelmed my opponent's ability to respond effectively. His carefully constructed defenses, designed for gradual pressure, collapsed under sudden, overwhelming force applied simultaneously across multiple fronts. But the victory taught me an equally important lesson about restraint. Once decisive results had been achieved, I had to resist the temptation to continue applying maximum force. Fire attacks are extremely costly and can't be sustained indefinitely. The skill is knowing not just when to light the fire, but when to control it and when to extinguish it. The daily practice became this. In any situation involving resistance or competition, I would assess whether this was a gradual pressure situation or a maximum force situation. For most challenges, I would apply steady, sustainable pressure. But when I identified genuine decisive moments, I would commit completely to overwhelming action within narrow time windows. I also learned to prepare for decisive moments before they arrived. Maximum force can't be improvised, requires having resources available, relationships aligned, and plans prepared so that when the critical moment comes, you can act immediately with full commitment. The signal fire torch reminded me that strategic thinking requires understanding the full spectrum of force application, from subtle influence to overwhelming power. Most of the time, subtle approaches are more effective and efficient, but there are moments when only decisive action will work, and failing to recognize and act on those moments often means missing opportunities that won't come again. My master's walking staffer simple piece of polished wood that became my constant companion in later years. Years represents the wisdom that comes only through long practice, and the understanding that strategic thinking must become as natural as breathing if it is to serve you truly. As I reflect on decades of applying these principles, I realize that the greatest transformation wasn't in my external achievements, but in how strategic thinking became integrated into my very nature. What began as conscious techniques and deliberate practices eventually became automatic ways of seeing and responding to the world. In my early years, I had to remind myself to assess situations strategically, to look beyond surface appearances, to consider timing and positioning. I would consult my artifacts, review my principles, and consciously apply the frameworks I had developed. Strategic thinking was something I did when facing important decisions or complex challenges, but over time, these practices became instinctive. I found myself automatically seeing the deeper patterns in situations, naturally considering multiple perspectives, instinctively recognizing leverage points and critical dependencies. Strategic thinking was no longer something I did. It had become something I was. This transformation happened through what I call the compound effect of daily practice. Each day of applying strategic principles built upon the previous day. Each situation where I chose strategic thinking over reactive thinking strengthened those mental pathways. Each success that resulted from strategic approaches reinforced the value of this way of thinking. The walking staff reminded me that mastery is not about perfection. It's about consistency over time. I made countless mistakes, misjudged situations, and applied principles incorrectly. But I kept practicing, kept learning, kept refining my understanding based on real-world feedback. What I discovered is that strategic thinking creates its own momentum. The more you practice seeing situations strategically, the more strategic opportunities you notice. The more you practice patience and timing, the more naturally you recognize the right moments for action. The more you practice understanding others deeply, the more effectively you can build relationships and alliances. But perhaps most importantly, strategic thinking creates a sense of calm confidence that transforms how you experience challenges. When you trust your ability to analyze situations, understand the real dynamics at play, and find effective responses, you don't panic when things don't go according to plan. You don't get overwhelmed by complexity or discouraged by setbacks. This calm confidence is not arrogance or complacency. It's the quiet assurance that comes from having reliable methods for understanding and responding to whatever situations arise. It's knowing that even if you don't have immediate answers, you have proven approaches for finding those answers. The daily practice that sustained this development was remarkably simple, treating every interaction, every decision, every challenge as an opportunity to practice strategic thinking. Instead of just reacting to events as they unfolded, I would pause even briefly to consider the deeper patterns, the longer-term implications, the strategic dimensions of whatever I was facing. This practice extended to the smallest details of daily life, how I structured my morning routine, how I prioritized tasks, how I approached conversations, how I managed my energy and attention. All of these became opportunities to practice strategic principles. The walking staff accompanied me on countless journeys, each one teaching me that strategic thinking is not a destination but a way of traveling. The principles I've shared with you are not rules to be followed rigidly, but tools to be adapted based on your unique circumstances and objectives. What matters most is not memorizing these techniques, but developing your own capacity for strategic thinking through consistent practice. Start with the morning assessment questions. Pay attention to positioning in your daily interactions. Practice reading the people around you more deeply. Look for leverage points in the challenges you face. Over time, these practices will become natural, and you'll find that strategic thinking enhances every aspect of your life, not just your professional or competitive situations, but your relationships, your personal development, your ability to create the kind of life you actually want. The greatest legacy I can leave is not the specific strategies I developed, but the understanding that strategic thinking is a capability that anyone can develop through patient, consistent practice. The principles are timeless because they're based on fundamental patterns of human nature and social dynamics that don't change, even as the surface details of life evolve. Your journey of strategic mastery begins today, with whatever situation you're currently facing. Apply these principles with patience and persistence, learn from both successes and failures, and trust that each day of practice is building capabilities that will serve you for the rest of your life. The path of strategy is long, but each step makes you more effective, more confident, and more capable of creating the outcomes you truly desire.